title of my story is The Things You Remember and the Things You Forget. The first thing I remember is screaming. My own screaming. In the room where my crib was, at the foot of the crib, there was a picture of a clown on the wall. I hate clowns. And I remember I had a nightmare that this clown, that sort of head bent to the side and this evil, demonic grin on its face, was coming out, one hand on each side of the picture, from inside coming out, and then one big, huge clown shoe stepping out of the frame onto the ground, and this immense giant of a clown just came and started looming over my crib, and its devilish painted on grin coming into my face, and I just knew I was going to get eaten by this clown. And I started screaming. And I woke up, and nobody came. I grew up in a home where I was never held as a kid. I was never told I was loved. I really didn't have a great childhood in a lot of ways. That's not really what this story is about in too great detail. There's lots of stories I can tell about my parents some other time. But one of the next things I remember is when I was about 5 years old or so. I don't know, maybe some of you remember there was a volcano that erupted in Washington right about 1980. It's called Mount St. Helens. When I was in kindergarten, my nickname was Mount St. Anderson, because the temper tantrums that I had were so eruptive and violent and destructive that I actually put the other kids around me at risk, and the teachers at risk too. There was just, you know, I had learned at a very early age not to have temper tantrums at home, because if my mom would out tantrum me. So really, it was only when I started going to school that I was in a place where people started paying attention to me, and I just didn't have any real social skills. And anytime I would want to play with somebody, or if somebody took a toy away from me, or something happened that I didn't like, it was just, there was all this rage and anger that came flying out of me, and there was no off switch. And the school eventually told my parents that if I was going to stay in school, that something had to be done. And I remember that I eventually wound up in group therapy at 5 years old at the County Psychiatric Hospital, Bergen Pines, which is in Bergen County, New Jersey. And so at 5 years old, I was in group therapy with other 5-year-olds, not with other, adults with rage issues, because that would have been really interesting. But I remember there were a couple of other boys in the group, and I kind of remember that we would talk about our feelings a little bit, talk about why everybody was picking on us, and I kind of remember there was a pool table, and sometimes we would play pool, and sometimes there was like we played football in the parking lot one time, and a lot of those memories are kind of a little fuzzy, but the one thing that I do really remember very clearly is when I went in and started doing those Saturday morning sessions. It was Mount St. Anderson. When I came out, the volcano was dormant. But nothing had really changed. There was nothing that they could do to fix my home. My parents were still who my parents were, and the problems we had were still the problems we had. But what I had learned was that I could not keep erupting the way that I had been. So instead, I just had all that anger kind of turned inside. And I became somebody who never fought. I didn't have any way to protect myself. I didn't push anybody away. I didn't really have any way to set boundaries. And I became the kid that everybody picked on. I was the easy target in my neighborhood. I remember I developed a strategy that whenever somebody was making fun of me, I would laugh. I would laugh because I had hoped that if I laughed with them, it would somehow make them think that, well, it wasn't as much fun to make fun of the kid who's laughing with you. maybe they would go on and find somebody else to pick on. Not really a good strategy, by the way. And I remember one day, I think maybe I was in 5th or 6th grade. I was walking home, and there was a kid in the neighborhood that I hadn't recognized. He was somebody who just moved into the neighborhood, and I knew that this boy was different because he wasn't making fun of me yet. So I figured maybe I should go talk to him. And he seemed really nice, and there was a man who came up by him. I assume it was his dad, and introduced himself to me and invited me over to their house. And I went in, and I remember he had ice cold pink lemonade in the refrigerator. And I just remember thinking that was absolutely amazing, because we didn't have pink lemonade in my refrigerator. And I remember the house was was cleanish, certainly a lot better than my house. My mom was a hoarder. And my house was truly a disaster zone. I mean, literally a disaster zone. When my parents finally moved out, it took dumpsters, multiple dumpsters, to get rid of all of the trash that was inside. And I just remember I would start spending time over at this man's house. I'd start, hanging out with the kid. And it really felt like for the first time in my life, there was an adult who was paying attention to me. Because we'd have these amazing conversations, and he would always listen, and he would seem really interested in what I had to say. And, instead of walking home from school and sort of ducking my head and wondering where the next, attack was going to come from, I felt like I had some place where I could go where somebody liked me. And I remember one day I went over there, and one of the things we talked about all the time was WWF wrestling, because this was back in the day when Hulkamania was running wild, Sergeant Slaughter and Jimmy Superfly Snuka coming off the top turnbuckle, and that was the stuff that boys were really into back in the day, and we would talk about that all the time. And I remember one time I went over, and the man asked me if I wanted to wrestle with the boy, WWF style. And I remember thinking that it seemed a little weird. I didn't really understand what that meant. So I was like, well, what does that mean? He's like, like WWF style, like you see on the TV, in your underwear. And I remember thinking, this just seems weird. But the boy really didn't seem to object, and went into his bedroom and took his pants off. And so I kind of figured, well, I guess it's okay. And we walked into the room and we wrestled, and I have this memory of him standing in the doorway with a camera taking pictures. I'm not really sure how much time elapsed between that memory and the next one, but I remember one time I went over, and there would be times every now and again when the boy wasn't there. I assume it was probably maybe it was a joint custody thing or something, but it wasn't uncommon for me to go over there with just the man there and not the boy. And I went in this one day, and the boy wasn't there, and I remember the man looked at me and he asked me if I wanted to wrestle with him, WWF style. And my stomach sank. And I knew in that moment something was really wrong. But the volcano was dormant. I had no way of knowing how to say no. All I knew how to do was to go along, because that's how I had survived. And so I walked into the bedroom, and I got on his bed, and I took my pants off, and I remember him getting on the bed in his underwear. And I remember there was an air conditioner in the window, and I turned my head, and I went into the air conditioner. And that was how I got through. I swear if I could hear the sound of that air conditioner today, I would recall it perfectly. I know now what I did was called dissociate. I left my body, literally. I don't remember clearly too many things after that. There's a whole stretch of my childhood that's kind of fuzzy. As very common for trauma survivors. But it is interesting, the things that I do remember. And I remember some things extraordinarily clearly. I can take you to the house where that man lived. It's on State Street. It's 2 streets over from Jersey Avenue, which is where I grew up. I could draw you a floor plan of that house, but I do not remember his name. And I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that. Hasn't been part of my journey. I haven't needed to delve too deep to get into that. And I think one of the reasons it's okay is because I've come to make peace with the fact that some of the things that I don't remember are probably some of the things that have saved me and allowed me to keep going. So why am I telling you all of this? Well, for one thing, I know I'm not alone, but I didn't know that for a really long time. Today, I run an organization called Male Survivor. You can learn more about us at malesurvivor.org, and we help men who've experienced sexual violence. One of the things that we don't really know, because we never talk about it, is 1 out of every 4 men will experience some form of sexual violence in their lifetime. And we don't talk about these stories nearly enough. And they're extraordinarily common stories, and we have to talk about them. One of the things that I've learned in the years that I've been helping other survivors is stories and telling our truth is a way of healing. It's healing for me to be able to share this story, and I know that maybe for somebody out there it's healing for them to hear me tell my story. So I wish I had a pithy joke to end on, but I will leave you with this one hopeful note. It's that healing is possible. I'm standing here today and I'm able to share this with you because I've had a lot of people who love me and support me and have allowed me to share my story, and I count you among them. So thank you for that.